Hello everybody, and this is another 2014 album review. And for this review, I am finally going to be talking about one of the all-time bands in hard rock, heavy metal, Judas Priest. And this is their newest disc, Redeemer of Souls. And this is their first album in 6 years since their Nastradamus album, which came out in 2008, which was a really great album, though a little lengthy and a couple of subpar songs, but it was an ambitious album that I really enjoyed. But this is the follow-up to it, and before this album came out, there were like reports going around that Judas Priest was thinking about retiring, and now that pretty much is no longer in the media now, although K.K. Downing, one of the original guitarists, retired from the band 3 years ago, which sucks because K.K. is one hell of a player, but Glenn Tipton is another great guitarist as well, and he's still in the band. So in place for K.K., you had Richie Faulkner, who played in Lauren Harris's band, and Lauren Harris is the daughter of Iron Maiden bassist Steve Harris. He played in her band for a long time, and then he got offered to play in Priest, and I'll talk about how he did later on the review, but to those out there who don't know, even though I shouldn't really even be saying it, but for those out there who are watching this who don't know who Judas Priest are, I'm going to give a brief history lesson for you. Judas Priest started in 1969, and they were one of the first heavy metal bands to come out of the woodwork, along with bands like Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, and Led Zeppelin. Although it was documented in the Metal Evolution documentary series when they were talking about the early British metal bands, Sabbath, Zeppelin, and Purple didn't identify themselves as metal. Judas Priest did identify themselves as metal, and they said that they were proud to wave the flag for heavy metal music. Even though Sabbath was the inventors of the genre, they just didn't identify their sound as being heavy metal, even though it was heavy metal. But Judas Priest was the first band to truly recognize themselves as being a metal band. And starting with albums like Rock-A-Rolla, and well, Rock-A-Rolla was basically based around kind of Black Sabbath or prog rock ideas within a metal album. It was a subpar debut, but showed their potential. But Sad Wings of Destiny was one of the first, like, screamy metal albums of all time, because Rob Halford just has an amazing voice. He can sing his throat out if he could. And then beginning on other albums like Sin After Sin, Stained Class, and Hellbent for Leather, originally known as Killing Machine, and then beginning in the 80s with albums like British Steel, Point of Entry, and Screaming for Vengeance, that's when they really started to rise up the radio charts and stuff like that with some great songs. But then with the album Turbo, which at that time was the most debated Priest album, because they were seemingly trying to follow in the footsteps of, say, like Twisted Sister or Motley Crue. Not really Motley Crue, definitely more of a Twisted Sister kind of idea, with having poofy hair and having songs that are decadent and stuff. And then they had their album Ram It Down, which wasn't that good. But then in the turn of the 90s, when they had their album Painkiller, probably the best Priest album you're ever going to hear, because they developed a more contemporary speed metal sound, because right around that time, they couldn't compete with bands at the time such as Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, Anthrax, Pantera. They wanted to appeal to that audience who were into very hard-driven metal. And those bands were definitely influenced by Priest, so Priest at one point was influenced by the power of thrash, to the point where they developed a speed metal, not really thrash, but like fast heavy metal, into that album, to the point where they were just taking off. And then Rob Halford left the band. That left the band in a little bit of limbo until a fellow Buckeye, Tim Ripper Owens, joined the band, and he was on 2 albums, which were, the first one, Jugulator, was okay. Demolition was actually really good. But then Halford came back in like 03, 04, where they did an Ozfest with Sabbath and Slayer and Slipknot and a bunch of other bands. And then they put out their first album with Halford since Painkiller, Angel of Retribution 05, and then they made Nastradamus, which that's been the album that has been now the most debated because some people love it, some people hate it. I liked it. I thought it was very interesting that they were taking on a concept album. And even though he had a couple of subpar songs and it was a little lengthy, it was still a great album in my opinion. But now we get the follow-up to that album, Redeemer of Souls, and enough of the history lesson, let's get into it. We kick off the album with the song Dragonaut, which I thought was a great starter for the album. He had some great riffing going on, and Rob Halford's definitely showing that even now in his early 60s, he can still wail, and indeed he can. The first single they put out of the album, the title track, Redeemer of Souls, I thought it was a solid track to kind of get people excited, but it just wasn't one of those songs that I would probably go back and listen to over and over from this album. It was just one of those songs that was more on the simple side, but didn't go many places, but still got the job done. Halls of Valhalla was actually one of my favorite songs on the album, and on the standard edition of the album, it was the longest song at a little over 6 minutes. I really liked that song. I thought Rob's voice was amazing on that track. And then it followed up with Sword of Damocles, which was another one of my favorite tracks for similar reasons as Halls of Valhalla. March of the Damned was a good song. I like how the drum beats were going on that track. It's just really, most of the stuff on that track didn't go many places, but like I said, when you have songs like that, they can still get the job done, and indeed, that's what that track did. Down in Flames was another track I really, really liked on the album. It was one of the shorter songs of the album, and although I just really enjoyed it, I really liked how Glenn Tipton and Richie Faulkner were able to put together the riffs on that track. Same with the song Hell and Back. Hell and Back was another personal favorite on there. Cold Blooded, now this is where the album started to go a little bit downhill, but Cold Blooded was an alright, it was a good track, but not really one I would listen to over and over. Metalizer, despite its simple lyrics, I really liked that track. I thought it had a really cool vibe to it, to the point where I really, really liked it. Crossfire and Secrets of the Dead were two solid tracks, though not really ones that struck me, because it's like you had some good riffs, but they just didn't go very many places at times. But then the last two tracks, Battle Cry and Beginning of the End. My personal favorite song now, Battle Cry. Song at a little over 5 minutes. Loved how they were able to construct that song. Whatever happened in the studio when they made that song, I applaud them, because that was an amazing track. I really, really loved it. And then the final track, Beginning of the End, which was kind of a little bit of a song that would be on like Nastradamus in terms of how it was with its softer sound, and it was a great closing track. I really, really loved that song. I really liked how the guitars were made on that album with the acoustic, or on that song with the acoustic, and I loved how it was very dark, and it was one of those songs that just had that overall haunting atmosphere to it. So overall, you had some great riffs and guitar solos from Glenn and Richie, and with Richie Faulkner bringing a new energy to the band, being the youngest member of the band at 34, he's able to show that he can actually write stuff, and he wrote some stuff on this album, where he collaborated with Halford and Tipton, and he did great. I thought this, for a first album of him being a part of, I thought it was really good. I thought he did a great job with the guitar and how he was able to construct the riffs, some of the riffs on the album. Rob Halford's voice still kicks ass. I mean, the guy's in his early 60s. He's still able to show that. He's still able to show to people who may criticize him for being too old to play in metal. He can still sing. So he was able to shut the critics up right there. The drums I thought were really good. The lyrics were more on the simple side, but it doesn't usually mean it's a bad thing. In fact, I thought it was a good thing for the album. Though, really, besides some of the songs going in directions that didn't go anywhere, but still didn't go in many places, but still got the job done, really the only other complaint I really have about this album is the production and the mixing. I thought the mixing was a little bit off, and the production I thought was pretty subpar. I mean, it's like the drums even though the drums were really good on how Scott Travis was able to play the drums, just the sound of them just didn't sound that great. The guitars the sound of it was alright, but at some points of the album it sounded like Halford was just screaming in my ear for no reason. That's how the production, I think, was. It just didn't really... It was like in the middle between produced and being raw, and it just didn't really sound that great. If it was my way, I would have hired Andy Sneap or Colin Richardson to do the production on this album. I think this album could have been a lot better sound-wise. But overall, this was a really good album. Despite he had some subpar songs, even though they were solid, it just wasn't more tracks I would probably go back to and listen to over and over and over again. They still got the job done, but you still got like great songs on the album like Dragon 9, Halls of Valhalla, Sword of Damocles, Down in Flames, Hell and Back, Metalizer, Battle Cry, and Beginning of the End. Those are the tracks I would recommend checking out. Although for Priest fans, I say they'll be pretty happy with this album because it's pretty much classic Priest style stuff from the 80s and the early 90s. Good stuff on this album. I give this an 8 out of 10. I thought it was a pretty solid release, although it's not Album of the Year. But it doesn't have to be Album of the Year to be a good album. This was a good album. 8 out of 10. And there you go. But anyways, guys, coming up, I'm going to be uploading the Wednesday night Q&A episode 1, where I'm going to be answering probably like 4 questions, but it's enough for a show, but there you go. But anyways, see you then.